You're walking through the most secure area in the kingdom, surrounded by the finest trained guards money can buy. These aren't just any soldiers. They're the elite, the cream of the crop, men who've dedicated their lives to protecting royalty. Their reflexes are lightning fast, their training is brutal, and their loyalty is absolute. Now imagine a single moment where all of that training, all of that preparation gets put to the ultimate test. Not in a grand battle or a planned siege, but in one explosive second when a desperate man with nothing left to lose decides to take his chances against the impossible. What happens when unstoppable force meets immovable object? When desperation clashes with duty? When a split-second decision changes multiple lives forever? This is the story of that moment, and everything that led up to it. A story of how quickly everything can change, how bravery and foolishness can look exactly the same, and how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the most unexpected places. Get ready for a tale that will keep you on the edge of your seat, because what you're about to read really happened, and the consequences rippled far beyond anyone could have imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of the royal palace, its golden rays catching the polished armor of the guards stationed at every corner. Marcus Blackwood adjusted his ceremonial helmet for the third time in 10 minutes, his dark eyes scanning the crowd of visitors that had begun to gather for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. At 28, Marcus had served the royal guard for 6 years, working his way up from a simple foot soldier to one of the most trusted protectors in the kingdom. His broad shoulders and imposing 6'2" frame made him an intimidating presence, but it was his sharp mind and lightning-fast reflexes that had earned him his position guarding the main entrance to the palace grounds. The ceremony was a tourist attraction, drawing hundreds of visitors each day to witness the precise, choreographed movements of the guards as they performed their age-old ritual. Marcus had participated in this ceremony over 1,000 times. Each movement burned into his muscle memory through countless hours of practice and repetition. Today felt different, though Marcus couldn't quite put his finger on why. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He attributed it to the unusually large crowd that had gathered, nearly twice the normal size for a Tuesday morning in October. Among the sea of faces, children pressed against the iron railings with wide eyes, their parents holding cameras and phones to capture the spectacle. Tour guides spoke in hushed tones, explaining the history and significance of the ceremony to their groups. Everything appeared normal, yet Marcus found himself more alert than usual, his trained senses picking up on subtle details that others might miss. Near the back of the crowd, a man in a worn brown jacket shifted nervously from foot to foot. Thomas Riley had been standing there for over an hour, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he watched the guards move through their preparations. At 45, Thomas looked older than his years, his face lined with the hard-won wisdom of a life spent struggling to make ends meet. 3 months ago, Thomas had lost his job at the textile factory where he had worked for nearly 20 years. The company had moved operations overseas, leaving him and hundreds of other workers without income or prospects. His savings had dwindled rapidly, and despite his desperate efforts to find new employment, no one seemed interested in hiring a middle-aged man with outdated skills. Yesterday, the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on his small house, the same house where he had raised his 2 children after his wife died 7 years earlier. His daughter Sarah was away at university on a scholarship, blissfully unaware of her father's financial struggles. His son Michael worked 2 jobs just to pay rent on his tiny apartment across town. Thomas had chosen to bear this burden alone, too proud to ask his children for help they couldn't afford to give. The letter from the bank sat folded in his jacket pocket, its harsh language still echoing in his mind. Final notice, legal action will be taken, vacate the premises. The words had driven him to this desperate moment, standing outside the palace with a plan that even he knew was insane. Thomas had read about it in the newspapers, how citizens in the old days could petition the crown directly, how the monarch was supposed to be the final arbiter of justice for those who had nowhere else to turn. It was an ancient rite, one that hadn't been exercised in decades, but technically it still existed in the legal code. His plan was simple in its desperation. Approach one of the guards, present his case, and demand an audience with the royal family. He knew it was a long shot, knew that security protocols had changed dramatically over the centuries, but it was the only option he had left. The knife in his pocket wasn't meant for violence. It was meant for emphasis, a way to show how serious his situation had become. As the ceremony began, Marcus took his position near the main gate, his polished boots clicking against the stone as he moved. The crowd fell silent, captivated by the precision and pageantry unfolding before them. Each guard moved with mechanical perfection, their synchronized steps creating a rhythm that had remained unchanged for over 200 years. Marcus's partner for the ceremony was Lieutenant James Crawford, a 24-year-old who had joined the Guard just 2 years earlier. Despite his relative inexperience, Crawford had proven himself to be reliable and quick-thinking, qualities that Marcus valued highly in the high-stakes world of royal security. The two men had worked together dozens of times, developing the kind of wordless communication that comes from shared training and mutual respect. Crawford's job was to remain stationary at the gate, while Marcus performed the more elaborate movements required by the ceremony. But both men remained constantly alert to potential threats. As Marcus began the intricate sword movements that formed the centerpiece of the ceremony, he caught a glimpse of movement in his peripheral vision. The man in the brown jacket was pushing forward through the crowd, his movements becoming more urgent and erratic. Years of training kicked in, and Marcus's grip on his ceremonial sword shifted almost imperceptibly from decorative to defensive. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as he forced his way through the packed crowd. Children stumbled aside as he pushed past, their parents shooting him annoyed looks that quickly turned to concern when they saw the wild desperation in his eyes. His hand found the knife in his pocket, not to use it, but to draw courage from its presence. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Excuse me, I need to speak to someone. I need help." The crowd began to murmur, sensing that something was wrong. A few people near Thomas started to back away, creating a small circle of space around him as he continued to push forward. His movements became more frantic as he realized the ceremony was nearing its end, and his window of opportunity was closing. Marcus completed his sword routine and began moving toward his final position when Thomas broke free from the crowd entirely. The man stumbled into the cleared space between the spectators and the guards, his worn shoes slipping on the polished stone. "Please," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence that had fallen over the courtyard. "I just need someone to listen. I've lost everything. My house, my job, everything. There has to be someone who can help." Crawford stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon. "Sir, you need to return to the designated viewing area immediately. This is a restricted zone." But Thomas was beyond reasoning. 3 months of rejection, humiliation, and mounting desperation had brought him to this breaking point. His hand closed around the knife in his pocket, not with malicious intent, but as a drowning man might grasp at a life preserver. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice rising with panic. "I've tried everything. I've been to every office, filled out every form, talked to every official. Nobody cares. Nobody listens. But you have to listen. You work for the crown, and the crown is supposed to protect its subjects." Marcus had stopped his ceremonial movements entirely now, his full attention focused on the man who had disrupted the ceremony. Every instinct he had developed over 6 years of service was telling him that this situation was about to escalate dramatically. The crowd had gone completely silent, hundreds of pairs of eyes watching the scene unfold. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people near the back began to quietly move away, sensing danger even if they couldn't identify its source. Thomas pulled the knife from his pocket, holding it not in a threatening manner, but almost pleadingly, as if the weapon itself might somehow make his case more compelling. "Look at this," he said, his voice breaking. "This is all I have left. This is what it's come to. A desperate man with a knife, begging for help from people who are supposed to serve justice." The moment the blade caught the morning sunlight, everything changed. Crawford's training took over completely, and he began moving toward Thomas with calculated precision. Marcus felt adrenaline flood his system as years of preparation condensed into a single moment of absolute clarity. "Sir, drop the weapon immediately," Crawford commanded, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "Drop it now and step back." But Thomas was beyond hearing commands. The knife trembled in his grip as he took a stumbling step toward the guards. "Just listen to me. That's all I'm asking. Just listen." What happened next would be debated and analyzed for months to come. Thomas, in his desperation and emotional breakdown, made a sudden movement toward Marcus. Whether it was an attempt at a threatening gesture or simply the unsteady stumble of a man at the end of his rope, no one would ever know for certain. What was certain was Marcus's response. 6 years of training compressed into a split-second decision as he saw the knife moving in his direction. His hand shot out with practiced precision, grabbing Thomas's wrist and twisting it with enough force to make the older man cry out in pain and surprise. The knife clattered to the ground as Marcus spun Thomas around, pinning his arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees on the cold stone. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, so fast that many in the crowd didn't even realize what had happened until it was over. "Weapons secured," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Suspect restrained." Crawford moved quickly to kick the fallen knife away from Thomas's reach, while Marcus maintained his grip on the sobbing man. Within moments, additional guards appeared from seemingly nowhere, surrounding the scene and beginning to move the crowd back to a safer distance. Thomas's desperate gamble had failed spectacularly, but as he knelt there on the palace courtyard with tears streaming down his face, he had no idea that his moment of desperation would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately change not just his own life, but the lives of everyone involved in ways no one could have predicted. The ceremony was over, but the real story was just beginning. The holding cell beneath the palace was nothing like the dungeons of old that tourists imagined when they visited the grounds above. Clean, well-lit, and surprisingly comfortable, it was designed more for temporary detention than punishment. Thomas Riley sat on the simple cot, his head in his hands, replaying the events of the morning over and over in his mind. The adrenaline had worn off hours ago, leaving behind a crushing sense of shame and defeat. What had he been thinking? Drawing a knife on the royal guard? He was lucky to be alive, let alone sitting in a cell instead of a hospital morgue. The weight of his actions settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, making it hard to breathe. Above ground, Marcus Blackwood was completing his 3rd interview of the day. The palace security chief, Captain Elizabeth Hartwell, had been thorough in her questioning, reviewing every detail of the incident from multiple angles. Marcus appreciated her professionalism. She wasn't looking to blame anyone, but rather to understand exactly what had happened and why. The suspect's movements were erratic from the beginning, Marcus reported, his voice steady and professional. "I first noticed him approximately 15 minutes before the incident. He appeared agitated and was pressing forward through the crowd in an unusual manner." Captain Hartwell nodded, making notes on her tablet. At 52, she had been with the palace security team for over 2 decades, working her way up through the ranks to become the first woman to hold the chief position. Her gray-streaked auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her green eyes missed nothing as she analyzed Marcus's account. "At what point did you determine he represented a credible threat?" she asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "When he produced the weapon and began moving toward us. Until that moment, he appeared to be having some kind of emotional breakdown, but not necessarily a dangerous one." The knife changed the calculation entirely. The captain set down her tablet and leaned back in her chair. "You did everything by the book, Sergeant Blackwood. Your response was textbook perfect, quick, decisive, and with minimal force necessary to neutralize the threat. The review board will almost certainly commend your actions." But Marcus didn't feel like celebrating. Something about the incident bothered him, something he couldn't quite articulate. The man's desperation had been real, his pain genuine. There had been no malice in his eyes, only despair so profound it had driven him to an act of desperation that defied all logic. "Captain," Marcus said slowly, "what do we know about the suspect? His background, I mean." Hartwell pulled up another file on her tablet. Thomas Riley, 45 years old, recently unemployed, facing foreclosure on his home. No criminal record prior to this incident. Lost his wife 7 years ago, has 2 adult children. By all accounts, he was a model citizen until his life began falling apart. The description confirmed what Marcus's instincts had told him during the confrontation. This wasn't a career criminal or a terrorist. This was a desperate man who had simply run out of options and made a catastrophically poor decision. "Has anyone spoken with him since the arrest?" Marcus asked. "The initial interrogation was completed about an hour ago," Hartwell replied. "He's been completely cooperative, claims he never intended to hurt anyone, that he was just trying to get someone's attention so he could petition for help. Says the knife was meant to show how desperate his situation had become, not as a weapon." Marcus felt something twist in his stomach. "What's going to happen to him?" "That's not really our concern, Sergeant. Our job was to neutralize the threat and secure the scene, which we did admirably. The legal system will take it from here." But as Marcus left the captain's office and returned to his regular duties, he couldn't shake the image of the man's face from his mind. The tears, the genuine shock when he realized what he had done, the way he had simply collapsed when Marcus restrained him. It haunted him in a way that more obviously dangerous encounters never had. Meanwhile, in her private study overlooking the palace gardens, Princess Catherine was reviewing the security reports from the morning's incident. At 31, she was third in line to the throne, but more importantly to her, she was the royal family's primary liaison with various charitable organizations and social welfare programs. Catherine had shoulder-length blonde hair and intelligent blue eyes that reflected a sharp mind dedicated to public service. Unlike some of her relatives who viewed their royal duties as ceremonial obligations, she had thrown herself wholeheartedly into understanding and addressing the real problems facing the kingdom's citizens. The report about Thomas Riley troubled her deeply. She had been working for years to improve the social safety nets that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of desperation. The fact that a previously law-abiding citizen had been driven to such an extreme act suggested that the systems she had helped design were failing in fundamental ways. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Sarah, it's Catherine. I need you to look into something for me." Sarah Mitchell had been Catherine's private secretary for 4 years, and more than that, she had become a trusted friend and advisor. At 27, Sarah possessed an remarkable ability to cut through bureaucratic red tape and get to the heart of complex issues. "What do you need?" Sarah asked, her voice warm but professional. "There was an incident at the palace this morning. A man named Thomas Riley. I want to know everything about his situation, what led him to this point, what options he explored where the system failed him." "I'll get right on it," Sarah replied. "How deep do you want me to dig?" "All the way down to the bottom." "And, Sarah, I want to know what we can do to help him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Catherine, you know there are protocols about royal involvement in legal matters." The man did threaten a guard with a weapon. "I understand the protocols," Catherine said firmly. "But I also understand that desperate people sometimes do desperate things. I want to know what drove him to that desperation, and I want to know if there's a way to address the root causes rather than just punishing the symptoms." While Princess Catherine was beginning her investigation into Thomas's background, Lieutenant Crawford was having his own crisis of conscience. The young officer had been replaying the morning's events in his mind, focusing particularly on the moments before Thomas had produced the knife. Crawford remembered the man's words clearly. "I just need someone to listen." There had been no hostility in his voice, no anger directed at the guards personally. He had seemed genuinely shocked when security protocols kicked in, and suddenly he was surrounded by armed men treating him as a threat. That evening, Crawford found Marcus in the guards' common room, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The older sergeant was staring out the window at the palace gardens, his expression thoughtful and troubled. "Mind if I join you?" Crawford asked. Marcus gestured to the empty chair across from him. Can't sleep either? Something about today doesn't sit right with me, Crawford admitted. I keep thinking about what that man said. About trying everything, going to every office, talking to every official. What if he was telling the truth? Marcus nodded slowly. I've been thinking the same thing. The way he looked when I restrained him, it wasn't the look of someone who had been planning violence. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized they had made a terrible mistake. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Crawford spoke up again. Do you think there's anything we could have done differently? It was a question that had been eating at Marcus all day. Tactically, no. We followed protocol perfectly. But strategically? Maybe. If we had recognized earlier that he was having a breakdown rather than planning an attack, maybe we could have de-escalated before it got to the point where weapons were involved. The captain said he's going to be charged with threatening a royal guard, Crawford said. That could mean years in prison. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. For a man who was just trying to get someone to listen to him. What do you think Princess Catherine would say if she knew the full story? Crawford asked quietly. It was a dangerous question, one that suggested a level of involvement that went well beyond their official duties. But Marcus had been wondering the same thing. The princess had a reputation for caring deeply about social issues, for going out of her way to help citizens who had fallen through the cracks of the system. I think, Marcus said carefully, that she would want to know all the facts before making any judgments. Crawford met his eyes across the table. Hypothetically, if someone were to bring those facts to her attention, what do you think would happen? Hypothetically, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. I think that person might find themselves in a great deal of trouble with their commanding officers. But it might also be the right thing to do. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, weighing the potential consequences against his growing conviction that Thomas Riley deserved better than to become another casualty of a system that seemed designed to grind up people who were already down. Let me ask you something, Crawford. Why did you join the Royal Guard? The younger man didn't hesitate. To serve and protect. To be part of something larger than myself. To make a difference. And do you feel like you made a difference today? Crawford's expression grew troubled. I followed orders. I did my job. But did I make a difference? I'm not sure. I think maybe I just made things worse for someone who was already suffering. Marcus nodded. That's exactly how I feel. And that's not why I joined this service. The two men looked at each other across the table, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They both knew what needed to be done, even if they couldn't quite say it out loud yet. Meanwhile, in his cell, Thomas Riley lay on his narrow cot, staring at the ceiling and wondering how he was going to explain this to his children. Sarah would hear about it eventually. News of an incident at the palace would make the papers, and someone would connect his name to the story. Michael would probably read about it online within hours. The shame was almost unbearable. He had raised his children to believe in doing the right thing, in working hard and playing by the rules. Now he would be remembered as the man who pulled a knife on the Royal Guard in a desperate bid for attention. But underneath the shame was something else, a tiny spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. For just a moment, when he had been speaking to the guards before everything went wrong, someone had been listening. Not just hearing his words, but actually listening to what he was trying to say. Maybe, just maybe, someone would continue listening even now. Maybe his desperate gamble, foolish as it had been, would somehow lead to the help he had been seeking all along. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to sleep, unaware that 3 floors above him, people were already beginning to ask the questions that would change his life forever. Princess Catherine's private study had been transformed into a makeshift investigation center. Documents were spread across every available surface, and Sarah Mitchell had been working through the night to compile a comprehensive profile of Thomas Riley's situation. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows illuminated a story of systematic failure that made Catherine's heart ache. The unemployment office has a record of 47 job applications he submitted over the past 3 months, Sarah reported, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. 47 rejections. Most companies didn't even interview him. Apparently his age and the fact that his skills were considered outdated made him unemployable in the current market. Catherine studied a photograph of Thomas from his employee file at the textile factory. He looked younger in the picture, proud in his company uniform, wearing the kind of smile that came from honest work and providing for his family. The contrast with the desperate man who had been arrested yesterday was heartbreaking. "What about social services?" Catherine asked. Surely there were programs available to help him. Sarah pulled up another file on her laptop. He applied for unemployment benefits, but the amount wasn't enough to cover his mortgage payments. He was referred to a job retraining program, but the waiting list was over 4 months long. Housing assistance had a 2-year waiting list. Emergency financial aid required him to be at least 30 days behind on his mortgage, by which time the foreclosure process would already be underway. So the system is designed to help people after they've already lost everything, Catherine observed grimly. What about his family situation? His daughter, Sarah, she's named after you, actually, is in her final year at university studying social work. Full scholarship, but she still works 2 part-time jobs to cover living expenses. His son, Michael, is 23, working 2 jobs just to afford rent on a studio apartment. Thomas kept his financial problems secret from both children because he didn't want to burden them or interfere with Sarah's studies. Catherine felt a familiar anger building in her chest, not at Thomas or his family, but at the systems that had failed them so completely. This was exactly the kind of situation her welfare reform initiatives were supposed to prevent. Yet somehow a good man had slipped through every crack in the safety net until desperation drove him to an act that could destroy the rest of his life. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, and was surprised to see Marcus Blackwood and James Crawford standing in the doorway. Both men looked as though they had slept poorly, and Marcus was clearly struggling with some internal conflict. "Your Highness," Marcus said formally, "we apologize for the intrusion, but we have a request that falls somewhat outside normal protocols." "Please sit down," Catherine said, gesturing to the chairs across from her desk, "and speak freely. What's on your minds?" Crawford glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Your Highness, we've both been thinking about yesterday's incident, and we wanted to share some observations that might not be in the official reports." Over the next 30 minutes, the 2 guards described their perspective on the events, emphasizing Thomas's emotional state, his genuine surprise when the situation escalated, and their growing conviction that they had witnessed a cry for help rather than a calculated attack. The man was desperate, Marcus concluded, not dangerous. There's a difference, and I think that difference matters. Catherine had been listening intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had heard alongside the information Sarah had gathered. "Gentlemen," she said finally, "what you've told me aligns perfectly with what my research has uncovered about Mr. Riley's situation. The question now is what we do with this information." "With respect, Your Highness," Crawford said carefully, "we were hoping you might have some ideas about that." Catherine smiled at the young officer's diplomatic phrasing. "As it happens, I do. But first, I need to ask, are you prepared to face potential disciplinary action for bringing this to my attention?" Both men exchanged glances before Marcus answered. "We joined the Royal Guard to serve and protect, Your Highness. Sometimes serving means doing what's right, even when it's not what's easy." "Good answer," Catherine said. "Sarah, please contact the Palace Legal Department. I want to know what options exist for addressing this situation without compromising the integrity of the security protocols or setting dangerous precedents." While Sarah made the necessary calls, Catherine found herself studying the 2 guards who sat across from her. Their willingness to risk their careers to help a man they had been forced to arrest spoke to exactly the kind of character she valued in the people who serve her family. "Tell me something," she said. "In your professional opinion, does Thomas Riley represent an ongoing security threat?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "No, Your Highness. I believe yesterday's incident was an aberration brought on by extreme circumstances. Under normal conditions, Mr. Riley appears to be exactly what his record suggests, a law-abiding citizen who made a very poor decision when he ran out of other options. And if those circumstances were addressed, if he had stable housing and employment prospects, I believe he would return to being the model citizen he was before his life fell apart. Crawford added. The man I saw yesterday wasn't a criminal. He was someone who felt invisible and powerless, and he made a desperate attempt to be seen and heard. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. What the guards were describing aligned with her own understanding of how desperation could drive good people to make terrible choices. It also presented an opportunity to address not just Thomas's immediate situation, but the systemic problems that had created it. Sarah returned from her phone calls with a mixed expression. The legal department says there are options, but they're complicated. The charges against Mr. Riley could potentially be reduced or dismissed if certain conditions are met, but it would require careful handling to avoid creating the impression that threatening royal guards is somehow acceptable. What kind of conditions? Catherine asked. Psychological evaluation, community service, restitution for any costs incurred during the incident, and some form of ongoing supervision to ensure there are no repeat occurrences. The key would be framing it as recognition that this was an anomalous incident driven by extraordinary circumstances rather than criminal intent. Catherine felt a spark of hope. And what about addressing the underlying issues that created those extraordinary circumstances? That's where it gets interesting, Sarah said with a small smile. There's actually precedent for royal intervention in cases where citizens have been failed by existing social services. It's rarely used, but the legal framework exists. Explain. The Crown has the authority to provide emergency assistance to subjects facing exceptional hardship, particularly in cases where existing government programs have proven inadequate. It's essentially a modern version of the ancient right of petition that Mr. Riley was trying to invoke. Marcus and Crawford looked at each other in amazement. So he was actually right? Crawford asked. Citizens really can petition the Crown for help? In theory, yes, Catherine replied. In practice, the mechanism has been largely forgotten because our modern social services were supposed to make it unnecessary. But when those services fail, as they clearly did in Mr. Riley's case, the ancient safeguard still exists. Sarah pulled up another document on her laptop. If we were to pursue this approach, we could address Mr. Riley's immediate housing crisis through emergency royal assistance, connect him with job training programs that have shorter waiting lists, and provide temporary financial support while he gets back on his feet. In return, he would need to complete community service and participate in counseling to ensure he has better coping mechanisms if he faces difficulties in the future. It would also, Catherine added thoughtfully, provide us with a case study for reforming the social services system to prevent similar situations from arising. We could use Mr. Riley's experience to identify the gaps in our current programs and develop better solutions. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since joining the Royal Guard. The sense that his actions might actually make a difference in someone's life rather than simply maintaining the status quo. Your Highness, he said, what would you need from us to make this work? Catherine considered the question carefully. Your continued cooperation with the legal proceedings, obviously. But more than that, I want you both to be involved in the community service portion of any agreement. Mr. Riley needs to understand the seriousness of what he did and the impact it had on the people who were just doing their jobs. You mean work with him directly? Crawford asked, surprise evident in his voice. I think it could be valuable for all concerned. You two understand better than anyone what it feels like to be put in an impossible situation through no fault of your own. And Mr. Riley needs to see that the guards he frightened yesterday are real people with their own families and concerns, not just obstacles standing between him and help. Sarah was taking notes rapidly, already beginning to sketch out the framework for what could become a groundbreaking approach to addressing both individual crises and systemic failures. There's one more thing, Catherine said. This entire approach depends on Mr. Riley's willingness to participate. We can't force help on someone who doesn't want it, and we can't reduce the charges without his agreement to the conditions. Someone needs to speak with him and explain what we're proposing. I'll do it, Marcus said immediately. I'm the one who arrested him. If anyone should explain his options, it should be me. Catherine studied the sergeant's face, seeing the determination there alongside a deep sense of responsibility for how events had unfolded. Are you sure about that? It's not going to be an easy conversation. Neither was arresting him, Marcus replied. But if there's a chance to turn this situation into something positive for everyone involved, then I want to be part of making that happen. As the meeting concluded and plans began to take shape, none of them could have predicted how Thomas Riley would react to their proposal. The man sitting in his cell, just a few floors below, had spent the night alternating between despair and a stubborn refusal to give up hope entirely. He had no way of knowing that his desperate gamble was about to pay off in ways he never could have imagined, or that the guard who had arrested him was about to become an unexpected ally in rebuilding his life. The conversation that would change everything was still hours away, but the foundation for transformation had already been laid. The question now was whether a man who had lost faith in the system would be willing to trust it one more time. The heavy door to Thomas Riley's cell opened with a metallic clang that made him look up from where he sat hunched over on his cot. He expected to see another lawyer or bureaucrat with forms to fill out and procedures to explain, but instead found himself face to face with Marcus Blackwood, the guard who had subdued him less than 24 hours earlier. Thomas's first instinct was to shrink back against the wall, memories of his humiliation flooding back in vivid detail. But something in the sergeant's expression stopped him. There was no anger or contempt there, only a careful professional concern mixed with something that looked almost like regret. "Mr. Riley," Marcus said quietly, stepping into the cell, but leaving the door open behind him. "My name is Sergeant Marcus Blackwood. I was hoping we could talk." Thomas's throat felt dry as sandpaper. "I suppose you want to know why I did it. Everyone else seems to want an explanation." "Actually," Marcus said, settling into the room's single chair, "I think I already understand why you did it. What I want to talk about is what happens next." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had experienced since his ordeal began. Marcus spoke not as an interrogator or a representative of the system that had failed him, but as one human being to another. He listened without judgment as Thomas explained the months of rejection, the mounting bills, the crushing weight of trying to solve an impossible problem while protecting his children from the truth of their situation. "When I pulled that knife," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wasn't thinking about hurting anyone. I just wanted anyone, to pay attention long enough to hear what I was saying. It was stupid, I know that now. But I felt invisible, like I was drowning, and everyone was just walking past, pretending not to see." Marcus nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about trying everything and having no one listen. I want you to know that someone was listening, even if it didn't feel that way at the time." "What do you mean?" "I mean that your situation has been brought to the attention of people who can actually do something about it. But before I explain what's being proposed, I need you to understand something important. What you did yesterday was serious. Pulling a weapon on royal guards, even in desperation, has consequences. Those consequences don't just disappear because your motivations were understandable." Thomas felt his stomach sink. He had been hoping against hope that somehow this nightmare might have a different ending, but Marcus's words seemed to confirm his worst fears. "However," Marcus continued, "there are people who believe that punishment without addressing the underlying problems serves no one. Princess Catherine has been reviewing your case personally, and she's proposed an alternative to traditional prosecution." For a moment, Thomas wasn't sure he had heard correctly. "Princess Catherine? Why would she care about what happens to me?" "Because," Marcus said, "she believes that when the system fails its citizens as completely as it failed you, the Crown has a responsibility to step in. What I'm about to explain to you is unprecedented in modern times, but it's not without legal precedent." Over the next hour, Marcus outlined the proposal that had been developed in Princess Catherine's study: emergency housing assistance to stop the foreclosure proceedings, job training, and placement services that could fast-track Thomas into employment, financial counseling to help him rebuild his stability. In exchange, he would plead guilty to a reduced charge, complete substantial community service, and participate in ongoing counseling to develop better coping strategies for future crises. "There's one more component," Marcus said. The community service will be served working with the Royal Guard on a new initiative to improve communication between palace security and citizens in crisis. You'll be helping to develop protocols to prevent situations like yesterday from escalating to the point where weapons become involved. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. You want me to work with the guards? After what I did? Not just the guards, Marcus clarified. Lieutenant Crawford and myself specifically. We both feel that yesterday's incident could have been handled differently if we had better training in recognizing and de-escalating emotional crises. Your experience could help us develop that training. But why would you want to help me? I threatened you with a knife. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Because I joined the Royal Guard to serve and protect people, and yesterday I realized that sometimes protection means more than just stopping threats. It means understanding why people become threats in the first place and addressing those underlying causes. The offer seemed too good to be true, and Thomas found himself looking for the catch. What if I fail? What if I can't handle the job training or I mess up the community service? Then, we'll figure out a different approach, Marcus replied. The goal isn't to set you up for failure. It's to give you the tools and support you need to rebuild your life. But I won't lie to you, Mr. Riley. This won't be easy. You'll be under scrutiny, you'll have to face the consequences of your actions publicly, and you'll have to work harder than you've ever worked to prove that yesterday was an aberration and not a pattern. Thomas felt tears starting to well up in his eyes. After months of closed doors and form letters and automated rejection messages, someone was offering him not just help, but hope. What do I need to do? First, you need to think about it. Really think about it. This isn't just charity. It's a partnership that requires genuine commitment from you. You'll need to sign a formal agreement, submit to regular check-ins, and complete every aspect of the program successfully. If you violate any terms of the agreement, the original charges will be reinstated, and you'll face the full legal consequences. Marcus pulled a folder from his jacket and set it on the small table between them. These are the details of the proposal. Take time to read through everything, talk to a lawyer if you want, and make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. This offer won't be available indefinitely, but you don't need to decide right now. As Marcus stood to leave, Thomas found his voice again. Sergeant Blackwood, why are you doing this? Really? Marcus paused in the doorway, considering the question. Because yesterday I realized that doing my job perfectly and doing the right thing aren't always the same thing. I want to find a way to do both. After Marcus left, Thomas sat alone with the proposal documents, reading through each page with growing amazement. The level of detail was extraordinary, not just addressing his immediate crises, but creating a comprehensive plan to help him rebuild his entire life. The housing assistance would not only stop the foreclosure, but provide him with temporary rental support while he stabilized the situation. The job training wasn't generic skills development, but specifically targeted placement in growing industries that valued experience over youth. But it was the community service component that truly amazed him. Instead of meaningless busy work, he would be contributing to something important, helping to ensure that other people in desperate situations wouldn't feel driven to the kinds of extreme measures he had taken. His experience, his suffering, would be transformed into something that could help others. That evening, Princess Catherine was in her private dining room, sharing dinner with her parents, King Edward and Queen Margaret. The conversation had inevitably turned to the previous day's security incident, and Catherine had been explaining her proposed intervention. "I understand your compassion, Catherine," the king said, cutting into his roast beef with precise movements. "But we must be careful about the precedent this sets. We cannot have every person with financial difficulties believing they can threaten our guards and receive royal assistance as a result." "That's exactly why the terms are so specific," Catherine replied. "Mr. Riley will face real consequences for his actions, including public community service that acknowledges the seriousness of what he did. But those consequences are paired with genuine help to address the problems that drove him to desperation in the first place." Queen Margaret, who had been listening thoughtfully, set down her wine glass. "What does Captain Hartwell think of this proposal?" She's concerned about security implications, naturally, but she agrees that Mr. Riley doesn't represent an ongoing threat. She's also intrigued by the idea of developing better crisis intervention protocols. According to her research, similar incidents have been increasing across the kingdom as economic pressures mount. The king frowned. Increasing? I wasn't aware we had a pattern of security threats. Not threats, exactly, Catherine said carefully, but incidents involving emotionally distressed citizens who feel they have no other way to get help. Most don't escalate to the level of yesterday's situation, but the underlying frustration is growing. This was news to both of her parents, and Catherine could see them processing the implications. The royal family prided themselves on being accessible to their subjects, but the reality was that modern security requirements made direct citizen contact increasingly difficult. Perhaps, Queen Margaret said slowly, this situation could serve as an opportunity to examine whether our current systems are adequate for addressing citizen concerns before they reach crisis levels. The king nodded thoughtfully. And this man, Mr. Riley, you believe he could contribute meaningfully to that examination? I think his perspective could be invaluable, Catherine said. He navigated, or failed to navigate, every level of our social services system. He knows exactly where the gaps are and what it feels like to fall through them. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Sarah Riley was on the phone with her brother Michael, both of them still trying to process the news of their father's arrest. Sarah had driven through the night to get home from university, and Michael had taken the day off work, something he couldn't afford to do, but family came first. I can't believe he didn't tell us how bad things had gotten, Sarah said, pacing the tiny living room of Michael's studio apartment. We could have helped somehow. Michael shook his head grimly. With what? You're barely keeping your head above water with school, and I'm working 70 hours a week just to pay rent. Dad knew there wasn't anything we could do except worry. But pulling a knife on the royal guard? That's not Dad. That's not who he is. No, Michael agreed. It's who he became when everything else got stripped away. The question now is what happens next. They had spoken briefly with their father's court-appointed attorney, but the man had seemed overwhelmed and distracted, giving them little hope that Thomas would receive anything more than perfunctory legal representation. The attorney had mentioned something about possible alternative arrangements, but had been vague about details. Neither of Thomas's children knew about the extraordinary intervention taking place just a few miles away, or that their father was at that very moment reading through a proposal that could transform not just his life, but their entire family's future. They couldn't know that the desperate gamble that had horrified them might actually be the catalyst for the help their father had been seeking all along. The next morning would bring Thomas's decision, and with it, the beginning of either a remarkable redemption story or a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to change a system from outside its established boundaries. The choice, ultimately, was his to make. 3 months had passed since the morning that changed everything, and Thomas Riley stood in the same palace courtyard where his world had come crashing down. This time, however, he wore a pressed uniform shirt with Palace Community Liaison embroidered on the chest, and he carried a clipboard filled with training materials rather than desperation and a hidden knife. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. The first weeks after accepting Princess Catherine's proposal had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, psychological evaluations, and intensive counseling sessions. Thomas had pled guilty to a reduced charge of disturbing the peace and threatening behavior, receiving a suspended sentence contingent on his successful completion of the rehabilitation program. The media attention had been intense, but generally sympathetic once the full story emerged. Rather than portraying Thomas as a dangerous criminal, most outlets focused on the systemic failures that had driven a law-abiding citizen to such desperate measures. Several investigative pieces examined similar cases across the kingdom, revealing a pattern of social service inadequacies that Princess Catherine used to advocate for broader reforms. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in the relationships forged through adversity. Marcus Blackwood and James Crawford had become not just Thomas's supervisors in the community service program, but genuine friends and advocates. The three men had spent countless hours developing new protocols for identifying and assisting citizens in crisis before their situations escalated to dangerous levels. "All right, gentlemen," Thomas addressed the group of new recruits gathered in the courtyard, his voice carrying an authority earned through hard experience rather than rank. "Today we're going to discuss de-escalation techniques for emotionally distressed individuals. Before we begin, I want you to understand that the person in crisis isn't your enemy. There's someone who feels they've run out of options." The training program they had developed together was already being implemented throughout the kingdom's security services. Thomas's unique perspective as someone who had experienced the system's failures firsthand proved invaluable in helping guards understand the mindset of people driven to desperate actions. "The key," Thomas continued, "is recognizing the difference between someone who wants to cause harm and someone who simply wants to be heard. The techniques for handling these situations are completely different." Marcus stood at the back of the group, watching Thomas lead the session with a sense of pride he couldn't have anticipated 3 months earlier. The man who had been broken and desperate had transformed into an effective educator and advocate, channeling his painful experience into something that could help others avoid similar crises. The housing situation had stabilized first. Emergency royal assistance had stopped the foreclosure proceedings, and Thomas was now living in a small but comfortable apartment near the palace, subsidized through a program that Princess Catherine had expanded based on his case. His mortgage payments were being restructured through a financial counseling program that had helped him understand exactly how his situation had deteriorated so rapidly. The employment front had taken longer to resolve, but the outcome had exceeded everyone's expectations. The job training program had initially focused on updating Thomas's technical skills for modern manufacturing, but his natural ability to communicate complex ideas and his genuine empathy for people in difficult situations had led to an unexpected career transition. He was now employed full-time by the palace as a community liaison specialist, a position created specifically to bridge the gap between citizens and government services. Part of his job involved the guard training program, but he also worked directly with people who were struggling to navigate the social services system, helping them access resources before their situations became desperate. "Remember," Thomas told the recruits, "when someone approaches you in an emotional state, your first goal is not to neutralize a threat. It's to understand what they need and determine whether you can help provide it safely. Most people in crisis just want someone to acknowledge their situation and take it seriously." The irony was not lost on him that he was now teaching others the very things he had desperately wished the system had understood about his own situation. But it was an irony that felt redemptive rather than bitter. After the training session concluded, Thomas walked across the courtyard to Princess Catherine's office, a route that had become routine over the past months. Their weekly meetings had evolved from formal check-ins on his progress to collaborative planning sessions for expanding the programs they had developed together. "How did the session go?" Catherine asked as Thomas settled into the chair across from her desk. The formal distance that had characterized their early interactions had given way to a comfortable, working relationship built on mutual respect and shared goals. "Very well, I think." The new recruits seemed genuinely interested in learning these techniques rather than just going through the motions. Marcus and Crawford have done an excellent job of selling the program to their colleagues. Catherine made a note on her tablet. "I've been getting positive reports from other locations where we've implemented the training. Incident reports involving emotionally distressed citizens are down by nearly 40% in areas where guards have completed the program." It was exactly the kind of outcome they had hoped for when the program began, but hearing the concrete statistics still filled Thomas with a sense of accomplishment he had rarely experienced in his previous career. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Catherine said, her tone becoming more serious. "We've received inquiries from several other kingdoms about implementing similar programs. There's interest in having you consult on developing crisis intervention protocols for their security services." Thomas felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with excitement. "You mean travel to other places? Work with different governments? If you're interested, It would mean expanding your role considerably, and there would be additional training required to understand different legal and cultural contexts. But your expertise has become quite valuable, and there's real demand for what you've learned. The offer was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. 6 months ago, Thomas had felt completely worthless, convinced that his skills and experience had no value in the modern world. Now he was being asked to share his knowledge with leaders in other countries. "What about my work here?" he asked. "The training program, the liaison work? That would continue to be your primary responsibility," Catherine assured him. "But we've proven that the model works, and now we have an opportunity to help other places develop similar systems. Think of it as expanding your impact." As Thomas considered the proposal, his phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter, Sarah. She had graduated the previous month with her degree in social work and had just accepted a position with the palace's newly expanded social services department. Her thesis had examined the gaps in the system that had nearly destroyed her father's life, and her recommendations had been incorporated into the ongoing reform efforts. "Dad, just got the final approval for the pilot program we discussed. 20 families will receive the comprehensive support package starting next month. This could be the beginning of something really important." Michael had also found his situation improving dramatically. The publicity surrounding Thomas's case had led to job opportunities for his son, who was now working as a logistics coordinator for a company that had been impressed by his work ethic and his family's resilience. He had been able to move into a larger apartment and was even considering returning to school to finish his degree. "You know," Thomas said to Catherine, 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I was convinced that I had nothing left to offer the world, that all my experience and knowledge were worthless. And now I realize that sometimes our most painful experiences can become our most valuable assets, if we find the right way to transform them into something that helps others." Catherine smiled. "That's exactly the philosophy behind everything we've built together. Your crisis became the foundation for helping others avoid similar crises." The meeting continued for another hour, covering the details of the international consulting opportunities and the ongoing expansion of their domestic programs. By the time Thomas left Catherine's office, he had agreed to begin developing materials for international implementation while maintaining his core responsibilities at home. As he walked home that evening, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. The desperate man who had pulled a knife in the palace courtyard was still part of him, but that desperation had been transformed into determination, and his crisis had become the catalyst for meaningful change. The apartment he entered was modest but comfortable, filled with furniture that had been saved from his original house, and supplemented by items provided through the Housing Assistance Program. On his desk were letters from other people who had read about his story and found hope in their own difficult situations. One letter, from a woman facing similar foreclosure proceedings, particularly touched him. "Reading about your experience made me realize that I'm not alone, and that asking for help isn't giving up. It's fighting back in a different way. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to find a path forward even when everything seems hopeless." These letters had become a regular part of Thomas's life, and he tried to respond to each one personally. Many of the writers were connected to the expanding network of services that had grown out of his case, and several had found their own paths to stability through programs that might never have existed if he hadn't made his desperate gamble that October morning. The phone rang just as Thomas was preparing dinner. A simple meal, but one he could afford without anxiety for the first time in over a year. The caller was Marcus, checking in as he did most evenings. "Just wanted to see how you thought the training session went today," Marcus said. "I was impressed by how the recruits responded to your presentation." "They seemed genuinely engaged," Thomas replied. "I think they're beginning to understand that their job is about more than just maintaining order. It's about protecting people, even when those people are acting in ways that seem threatening. That's exactly the shift we were hoping to achieve." Crawford mentioned that he's been getting requests from other departments to attend the training sessions. Word is spreading that this approach actually works. As they talked, Thomas looked out his apartment window at the palace grounds visible in the distance. The building that had once represented everything he couldn't access, all the help he couldn't get, now stood as a symbol of transformation and possibility. The conversation with Marcus reminded him of something that still amazed him: how quickly enemies could become allies when people were willing to look beyond surface actions to understand underlying motivations. The guard who had restrained him was now one of his closest friends, and the institution that had once seemed imperviously hostile had become the source of his redemption. Later that evening, as Thomas prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the children who had watched that morning's incident from behind the palace railings. He wondered what they had learned from seeing a desperate man make a terrible decision, and whether they would remember the story of what happened next, how that terrible decision became the beginning of something much better. Tomorrow would bring new training sessions, new people to help, and new opportunities to transform pain into purpose. The man who had once felt invisible and powerless now had a platform from which to ensure that others in similar situations would be seen and heard before their desperation drove them to desperate measures. Thomas Riley's story had become proof that sometimes the most broken people can become the most effective healers, and that the systems designed to help people work best when they're informed by the experiences of those they've failed. His moment of crisis had become a catalyst for change that would help countless others avoid the kind of desperation that had nearly destroyed him. As he turned off the lights, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine optimism about the future, not just for himself, but for all the people who would benefit from the programs born out of his darkest moment. The thug who had stabbed at hope with a desperate knife had become the architect of a better way forward, and his story was just beginning.